In the summer of 1858, along the fog-choked coast of Maine, travelers passing through the village of Damariscotta noticed something so subtle yet so unnatural that it chilled them to the bone. The town was alive in all the usual ways: smoke curling from chimneys, children walking to the small schoolhouse, fishermen mending nets beside the harbor. But what struck every visitor and later appeared in countless diaries and letters was the absence of a single sound that should have been everywhere. No one laughed. Not the children chasing one another through the dirt streets, not the men sharing tobacco outside the inn, not the women hanging wash along the fences. Voices were quiet, measured, and entirely serious. Even in the tavern, where sailors elsewhere roared with cheer, conversation remained muted, as though each man were careful not to let joy escape his lips. Days passed without a single chuckle, a single burst of amusement. The silence was not of death, but of suppression, as if mirth itself had been banished. Rumors spread quickly. Some claimed a curse had fallen upon the place, brought by a traveling preacher who denounced laughter as the language of the devil. Others whispered of a strange sickness, an ailment that stole humor from the mind as consumption stole breath from the body. More sensational accounts insisted that the townspeople themselves were complicit, enforcing the silence with quiet severity, ensuring that no smile passed unpunished. Whatever the truth, journals from 1858 described Damariscotta as a community shrouded in solemnity, where joy was absent and where the very act of laughter had become forbidden. What was once dismissed as superstition survives in fragments: church records, physicians' notes, and the recollections of horrified travelers who swore never to return. The story of the town without laughter is not one of merriment denied, but of control enforced, and of a community whose silence masked a darkness far deeper than anyone could have imagined. Before we go deeper into this unsettling account, pause for a moment and consider what it means for an entire community to live without laughter. These stories are not for everyone. They reveal the shadows polite history tried to erase. If you are among the few willing to face them, then stay with us. Subscribe to Anathema of Fear, ring the notification bell, and share this video with someone who thinks they can endure it. In the comments, tell us where you are watching from. Each place added becomes a reminder that silence and dread are never as far from us as we like to believe. In the mid-19th century, Maine was a land of rocky coastlines, salt-scarred villages, and communities bound together by the rhythms of the sea. Damariscotta, though modest in size, stood as one of these coastal settlements. Its wooden homes clustered near the harbor where fishing vessels bobbed against the tide. The village was typical in many ways: weather-beaten houses lined with clapboard, a church steeple rising against the horizon, and narrow lanes that wound toward fields of potatoes and corn. Life was hard, but no harder than in any of the other towns along the coast, where men risked their lives daily at sea, and women tended farms, raised children, and bore the weight of constant loss. Visitors noted the industry and order of the place, but they also sensed something else, something difficult to define, even before the strangeness was named. The community was rooted in discipline. Families descended from stern Puritan stock carried with them an ethic of sobriety and devotion. From a young age, children were taught to speak sparingly, to pray often, and to labor without complaint. In a world marked by storms, shipwrecks, and disease, survival demanded endurance. Humor, when it did surface, was often brief and quiet, quickly suppressed in favor of solemn duty. Yet in Damariscotta, this restraint had grown into something more absolute, until outsiders found themselves unsettled by the gravity of daily interactions. The tavern was silent except for the sound of tankards placed on wood. At the market, exchanges were made with nods rather than banter. The church congregation sang hymns with precision, but their voices carried no warmth, only measured tones like a chant. The schoolhouse, too, reflected this order. Teachers instructed with strict seriousness, emphasizing scripture and arithmetic, drilling children with relentless regularity. Smiles were rare and laughter almost non-existent, even among the young. Visitors found the children unnerving in their composure, standing in lines without chatter, responding to lessons without giggles or restlessness. Diaries from traveling preachers remark on the eerie quiet that filled the classroom, describing it as an obedience more fitting to soldiers than to the young. Yet parents praised it as a sign of virtue, proof that their children were disciplined in both body and spirit. The landscape itself seemed to mirror the people's disposition. Fog rolled in from the sea and clung to the streets, muting sound and softening outlines. Even in summer, when other villages rang with song and laughter during festivals, Damariscotta remained subdued. Weddings were conducted with formality, funerals with severity, and Sabbath with such intensity that visitors described it as suffocating. No one could recall when laughter had last echoed openly in the streets. Some older residents hinted that it had not always been so, that decades earlier the town had been much like its neighbors. Something had changed, though none would speak directly of what had brought about the transformation. By 1858, the absence of laughter had become so complete that it defined the identity of the town. To outsiders, it was a curiosity, an unsettling oddity whispered about in taverns across Maine. To those within, it was simply life, a discipline inherited and enforced. Whether by choice, fear, or compulsion, the people of Damariscotta lived in a state of unyielding solemnity, their lives a continuous act of restraint. Beneath the surface, however, that restraint concealed something more disturbing, a silence that would soon reveal itself as less the product of faith than of something far darker. The heart of Damariscotta's mystery lay not only in the absence of laughter, but in the structures and figures that enforced this strange order. At the center stood Reverend Elijah Harrow, the pastor of the town's single church, a man whose presence seemed to embody the very gravity of the place. Harrow was tall and gaunt, his features severe, his eyes described in journals as hollow yet commanding. He preached with fervor about sin and repentance, rarely speaking of grace and never of joy. His sermons painted the world as a valley of trials, where indulgence of the flesh, even in the form of laughter, was a betrayal of divine discipline. Parishioners sat in silence as he thundered, nodding only when he paused, their faces expressionless, as if shaped by years of listening to words that stripped emotion rather than stirred it. Beside him, the elders of the congregation upheld the same ethos. They were farmers, shipwrights, and widowers who had buried children at sea or in shallow graves behind their homes. They carried their grief as though it were armor, wearing solemnity like a badge of endurance. These men and women acted as both guardians and enforcers of silence, correcting children who giggled, disciplining youths whose spirits proved too lively, and shaming anyone who attempted to bring levity into worship. To them, restraint was not just a practice, but a communal law, one that bound them together in the face of hardship. Yet diaries kept by outsiders noted how unnatural this enforcement felt, as though joy itself had been criminalized. The children of the village reflected this inheritance with eerie precision. School teachers described their obedience as remarkable but also troubling. They spoke in measured tones, answered questions without hesitation, and worked with mechanical focus. When traveling inspectors visited the schoolhouse, they noted that the students performed admirably in recitation, but showed no spark of humor or curiosity. Not a single child smiled when praised. It was as though mirth had been excised from them before they could even understand what it was. In the evenings, when children elsewhere played games in fields, those of Damariscotta walked home quietly, carrying books or chores, their eyes downcast, their lips still. The homes of the town bore the same atmosphere. Inside the modest wooden houses, families sat at tables in silence, eating quickly, conversations clipped to necessities. Even weddings were subdued affairs, conducted with formality so stark that visitors mistook them for funerals. Songs sung at gatherings were slow, mournful hymns, rather than jigs or ballads. When music was played, it carried no liveliness, only somber notes that seemed to echo the fog that clung perpetually to the coast. Visitors remarked that even the tavern, usually the one place in any town where cheer could not be suppressed, remained quiet. Men sat in corners sipping ale in silence, exchanging words sparingly and never breaking into laughter no matter how much they drank. Over time, travelers began to document the strangeness. Merchants passing through spoke of an oppressive stillness, describing it as a weight upon the chest. One journal from 1858, written by a sailor on shore leave, tells of walking through the streets and realizing that he had not heard a single laugh, not even from children. He wrote that the silence made the town feel hollow, as if emptied of some essential spirit. Others noted that those who stayed too long in the village found themselves affected, losing their sense of humor, growing serious and restrained without realizing it. Some left after only a few days, unnerved by the transformation they felt creeping into their own speech and manner. The deeper question was whether this silence was chosen or imposed. Some whispered that Reverend Harrow had declared laughter sinful in one of his earliest sermons, and that since then the town had fallen under a kind of spiritual tyranny. Others believed that a tragedy had robbed the community of joy, a plague, a shipwreck, or a curse that left no room for laughter thereafter. Whatever its origin, by 1858, the prohibition was complete, unchallenged, and absolute. Families did not laugh together, children did not giggle in class, and neighbors did not share merriment over meals. The town had become defined by what it denied. By then, Damariscotta was no longer simply a community marked by sobriety. It had become something far stranger, a place where silence was law, and where joy itself was banished, as if it were the most dangerous indulgence of all. Beneath the discipline and devotion lay an unspoken fear, a terror of what might happen if the silence were broken. The town's refusal to laugh was not only habit but compulsion, a ritual woven into daily life that hinted at a force far more sinister than mere piety. And as the year unfolded, the consequences of this unnatural restraint began to reveal themselves. The first sign that the absence of laughter in Damariscotta was more than discipline or piety came in the late spring of 1858, when an itinerant peddler named James Corbett stopped in the town on his way north. Corbett was a man known across Maine's coastal villages for his good humor and quick tongue. He made his living selling ribbons, knives, and small goods, but he was remembered for his jokes more than his wares. Children often followed him through the streets of other towns, laughing at his stories, while taverns welcomed his banter as a break from the monotony of labor. When he arrived in Damariscotta, however, he was met not with amusement but with blank stares. His quips fell flat, his jovial remarks were answered with silence, and even the children turned their faces away, as though refusing to acknowledge his antics. At first, Corbett assumed he had encountered an unusually severe crowd. He pressed on, determined to stir mirth from the stone-faced villagers. At the market square, he raised his voice and began one of his stories, a tale of sailors who mistook a goat for a ghost on a foggy night. In any other town, the story would have elicited laughter. Here, it brought only silence. A few paused to listen, their eyes fixed on him with unsettling stillness, but no smile, no chuckle, no hint of amusement broke across their faces. Corbett faltered, his words drying in his throat as he realized the villagers were not uninterested but hostile to the very act of humor. The silence pressed down on him until he packed up his goods and moved on, muttering about a town of the dead. He did not make it beyond the next village. 3 days later, Corbett was found collapsed by the roadside, his belongings scattered, his face contorted in what witnesses described as a grimace frozen halfway between laughter and horror. There was no sign of injury, no evidence of illness. He had simply fallen, his body lifeless though intact. His death was marked as sudden failure of the heart, but in the margins of the report, someone scrawled, "He tried to make them laugh." The coincidence was noted by those who had seen him in Damariscotta, and a pattern began to take shape in hushed speculation. The incident might have been dismissed as an unfortunate accident, were it not for what followed weeks later. A young teacher from Augusta, hired to instruct at the schoolhouse, arrived determined to bring some liveliness to her lessons. Miss Abigail Whitcomb was bright, well-educated, and accustomed to engaging her students with games and stories. On her second day, she attempted to lighten the mood by telling a humorous parable meant to illustrate arithmetic. The children, obedient as ever, remained silent, their eyes fixed unblinking on her. Disturbed, she tried again, offering a playful riddle. Still no response. Then, to break the tension, she laughed aloud, expecting the children to follow. What followed was not laughter but a low, collective murmur, a sound so strange she stopped instantly. The children's eyes had not shifted, but their lips moved together in a whisper she could not understand. The sound rose only slightly before stopping in unison. Abigail, shaken, ended her lesson abruptly. That evening she fell violently ill, seized by fits that local physicians could not explain. Within 2 days, she was dead. Her body showed no marks of disease, but neighbors reported that her expression in death was twisted into a grotesque smile. Her lips curled unnaturally as though frozen in the act of laughter. After these incidents, the pattern was no longer coincidence. To laugh in Damariscotta, or even to attempt to provoke laughter, was to invite death. The townspeople did not speak of this openly, but the silence surrounding the events was itself an admission. They continued their solemn routines, showing no outward fear, but travelers passing through recorded the heavy atmosphere that clung to the place. Diaries preserved in historical societies describe Damariscotta as a town under prohibition of joy, a phrase that captures the unnatural severity of life there. The most chilling testimony came from another outsider, a sailor awaiting repairs on his vessel, who lodged at the local inn. Curious about the strange discipline of the place, he attempted to test the boundaries. Over supper, he told a bawdy joke meant to loosen the tongues of his fellow diners. The response was immediate and terrifying. Every person in the room turned to face him, their eyes blank, their faces expressionless. The innkeeper quietly instructed him to leave, his voice calm but firm. The sailor reported that as he walked into the night, he heard footsteps behind him, though when he turned, no one was there. Within days of departing, he was found drowned near the harbor mouth, though he had not gone to sea. His death was recorded as accident, but his shipmates muttered another explanation. He had tried to break the silence of Damariscotta. By the summer of that year, word of the town's prohibition spread across Maine. Some avoided it entirely, steering clear of its harbor. Others visited out of morbid curiosity, only to leave quickly, unnerved by the atmosphere. For those who stayed too long, the lesson became clear. Laughter was not merely absent from Damariscotta. It was forbidden, punished not by law, but by something deeper, something that reached into the very breath of those who dared to break the silence. The deaths of Corbett, Whitcomb, and the sailor marked the beginning of the town's dark legend, the first undeniable proof that joy itself had been banished, and that those who defied this unspoken rule paid the ultimate price. By midsummer, the lesson carried by the deaths of the peddler, the schoolteacher, and the drowned sailor hardened into law. Damariscotta organized its life around the prohibition it had once treated as custom. The elders established watches to police gatherings, posted notices at the tavern and market that condemned levity and instructed families in techniques to suppress involuntary mirth. Mothers pressed coins between a child's teeth when company came to dull the shape of a smile. Men kept river stones in pockets to bite when stories threatened to warm the room. Weddings were shortened to a bare exchange of vows. Harvest suppers ended before lanterns could cast the friendly shadows that invite humor. Joy was not simply absent, it was patrolled. The first resident to die after allowing laughter to escape did so without witnesses. A washerwoman working at the riverbank slipped on eelgrass and caught herself against a rock, startled by her own clumsiness. The sound that rose from her throat was small, almost a cough, but the coroner's book recorded her later found on the path home, lips drawn back in a rictus, eyes wide as if surprised by her own expression. There were no bruises, no water in the lungs, no lesion the doctor could name. Word moved through the lanes as caution rather than grief. The town marked her passing with a quiet burial and a harder silence. Other deaths followed with unnerving regularity. At a wedding, a candle guttered and spat resin, sending a ribbon of smoke across the bride's veil. A ripple of breath passed through the pews as guests suppressed their reactions. By nightfall, the groom's younger brother was found in his bed, with jaw locked and fingers dug into the quilt, his face set in a tiny, unmistakable upward curl. A week later in the schoolyard, a boy stumbled during drill and snorted. By evening, fever overtook him with a speed that defied the slow progress of ordinary illness. The parish ledger carried none of the language of accident. It only stacked names against dates with a steadiness that accused by omission. Families adapted their homes to the new peril. Wind chimes were removed, mirrors draped, and the little household amusements that could set a table to laughter, carved toys with painted grins, riddling almanacs, sailors' scrimshaw with comic scenes, were boxed or burned. Infants were trained toward stillness by rhythm more than comfort. The midwife taught mothers to pace steps and count breaths until fussing dulled into silence. In some houses, this discipline veered into danger. A child lulled too far into quiet could not be raised from it. 2 small burials in the churchyard bore dates aligned with nights, when lullabies were replaced by the slow, strict hum the elders recommended. Men at sea felt the prohibition even on open water. Fishermen once kept themselves alert with stories in foul weather, but the crews out of Damariscotta worked in wordless coordination. When a deckhand near the bow coughed a sound that might have been the first syllable of amusement at a gull that slid across the spray and landed startled on the net, the others froze. He finished the trip pallid and glassy-eyed, and was laid out by morning with a face that looked like a smile carved wrong. The crew cut their lines early the next day and filed their catch in perfect order back on the dock, as if obedience offered an exchange against future risk. A physician from Wiscasset visited at the elders' invitation, hoping to anchor the dread to anatomy. He described the deaths as a species of seizure linked to paroxysm of the chest, a sudden failure of breath when the body attempted a motion it had unlearned. He wrote of nervous exhaustion, of overtrained restraint, of a community so practiced in suppression that the smallest lapse produced catastrophe. His notes grew less certain as the list of cases lengthened. He could not account for the drownings without water, the stoppages without struggle, the way faces fixed in smiles that no one had seen form. He left prescriptions for tonics and admonitions to rest, and returned to his town with hands that shook when asked to speak of what he had seen. Reverend Harrow folded the physician's uncertainty into doctrine. A day of gravity was instituted each month, a fast without speech that concluded only when the sun fell and a bell was struck once. Households were urged to conduct evening examinations, noting any lapse in countenance or tone. The elders conducted quiet circuits after dusk, pausing outside windows to listen for outbursts. Neighbors became auditors of one another's restraint. A system of tokens appeared, small wooden discs a family exchanged for having passed a week without incident. A missing token at the next meeting hinted at an error no one named. The discipline bound the town tightly, and with each turn of the calendar its vigilance intensified. Outsiders kept clear. A traveling photographer who had planned to take daguerreotypes of the harbor asked a blacksmith for advice and was told to move along. The postmaster noticed letters leaving Damariscotta grew shorter and plainer, stripped of the idioms and asides that make correspondence human. A merchant who supplied tinware wrote in his log that the town paid promptly and spoke little, and that its people moved as though sound might break them. News of the prohibition spread across peninsulas and islands like fog, touching neighboring villages with a chill that sent their own pastors to reassure congregations that laughter was not a doorway for ruin. Inside the town, old customs were refitted to the new rule. The harvest gathering became a procession without music. Children's recitations were delivered in rigid unison, stripped of the comic verses that once sweetened memory work. Winter brought gatherings that looked like vigils rather than holidays. The year turned, and the silence did not relax. A few families attempted to leave for inland mills, thinking distance would liberate their throats. A woman who found work in a textile town upriver was said to have smiled at a fair at the sight of a dog trained to dance, and she was found that night with the familiar frozen mouth. The reach of the prohibition appeared to travel with those marked by it. By the close of autumn, Damariscotta had remade itself into an instrument that measured and corrected the smallest tremor toward joy. The restraint once practiced as virtue had matured into a system with rituals, audits, and consequences. The deaths did not lessen. They merely moved closer to the center of town life, touching families who had once believed themselves insulated by obedience. Beneath the discipline lay a pressure more than human, a sense that the silence now kept itself, that it did not need sermons or watches to endure, and that the cost of breaking it would continue to rise until someone understood what had yoked the town to so deadly a calm. By the winter of 1858, the silence that defined Damariscotta had hardened into something more suffocating than custom or fear. It had become a condition of existence, an unspoken law inscribed into the bones of the town itself. The deaths that followed laughter had become too numerous to dismiss, and the citizens responded not with rebellion but with a strange, fanatical obedience. Families learned to anticipate danger in the smallest of expressions. A cough mistaken for a chuckle was enough to send shivers through a household. Parents pressed their children into silence with a severity that bordered on cruelty, training them to erase every hint of amusement before it could escape. The town had become a place where grief was safer than joy, and restraint was the only acceptable form of devotion. The local schoolhouse reflected this new order with mechanical precision. Children recited verses without inflection, their voices blending into a monotone chorus that filled the air with a hollow weight. Their teacher, a woman once known for her fondness of riddles and small jokes, erased every trace of levity from her lessons, replacing them with arithmetic drills and scripture recitations stripped of warmth. Observers noted how the children's faces remained expressionless, even when praised. Some described them as little wooden figures carved into obedience by forces that no one dared name. The silence spread beyond human voices into the fabric of the town itself. Taverns fell quiet, not through sobriety, but through necessity. Merchants no longer shared banter across their stalls. Even animals seemed to absorb the gloom. Dogs did not bark, and crows perched on rooftops with an unusual stillness. Travelers who passed through spoke of an atmosphere that felt not merely grim but unnatural, as though the very air conspired against laughter. Those who lingered too long began to feel it themselves, a heaviness that dulled the urge to smile, a pressure that bent even the most cheerful spirit into submission. The church, under the guidance of Reverend Harrow, became the fortress of this new order. His sermons grew harsher, stripped of comfort and steeped in warnings about temptation. He no longer spoke of redemption, only of vigilance, of the peril hidden in joy. Parishioners sat as still as the dead, nodding at his words but never daring to let emotion touch their faces. The congregation's silence became an act of collective survival, an offering to whatever force had claimed dominion over the town. To laugh was to challenge not only social order but the invisible presence that enforced it. And yet, for all the caution, the deaths continued. A midwife succumbed after letting slip a nervous laugh at the fumbling of a young father. A farmer's son was found lifeless in the barn after grinning at a calf's awkward leap. Each incident tightened the grip of terror, convincing the townspeople that no amount of restraint was enough. The very act of feeling amusement, even if suppressed, seemed to invite disaster. Faces grew gaunter, postures stiffer, until the entire town resembled a congregation at perpetual funeral rites. Rumors began to spread that the curse had become self-sustaining. Some whispered that the silence no longer required an origin, but had taken root in the soil and the air. Others believed that the deaths were no longer punishments for laughter, but sacrifices demanded by an unseen force. Families spoke in hushed tones of shapes glimpsed at the edges of fields, of figures that dissolved into mist when approached, of whispers that rose from empty rooms in tones too faint to discern, yet too insistent to ignore. The silence, they said, had become inhabited. The physician who had once attempted to explain the deaths in terms of nervous exhaustion and suppression found himself withdrawing from practice. His notes, when later discovered, revealed his despair. He wrote of a contagion of silence, a force that did not merely punish sound but altered the very nerves of those who resisted. He observed that even the strongest men grew subdued after months in the town, and that newcomers, however cheerful at first, became solemn within weeks. His final entry suggested that the phenomenon was no longer psychological, but had crossed into something biological, a condition that rewrote the body itself. The escalation reached its peak when entire gatherings fell under its spell. At a funeral that winter, mourners watched as a grieving widow collapsed, her sobs breaking into a sound too close to laughter. The congregation froze, and moments later she was found lifeless beside the grave, her mouth fixed in a grimace no one dared describe. The funeral turned into 2 and the second into 3, until the cemetery expanded faster than any other plot of land in the town. Death had become contagious, not through disease, but through the faintest suggestion of joy. By year's end, Damariscotta was no longer a community in mourning, but a machine of suppression. Every home, every gathering, every street corner echoed with a silence so absolute that it seemed to throb in the ears. The town had entered a new phase, one where fear was no longer a response, but a condition of being. And beneath it all lay the unshakable sense that something was listening, waiting, and feeding on the absence it had created. If the silence of Damariscotta already chills you, know that the darkest revelations remain ahead. These stories are not crafted for comfort, but to uncover the shadows, polite history buried. If you have the courage to face what others would rather forget, subscribe now to Anathema of Fear, ring the notification bell, and share this tale with someone who thinks they can endure it. In the comments, Tell us where you are watching from, so every voice becomes a witness to the silence that once consumed a town. By the spring of 1859, the silence of Damariscotta had ceased to be a discipline and had hardened into something that seemed less chosen than imposed. Outsiders who passed through were struck not only by the absence of laughter, but by the absence of reaction itself, as though the townspeople lived in a perpetual state of suppression, every gesture guarded, every sound measured. The escalation of deaths following even the faintest breach had convinced the villagers that their survival depended on total obedience to an unspoken prohibition. Yet the climax of the town's ordeal came not in the steady accumulation of tragedies, but in a single event that would define its legend for generations: the night of the gathering. The occasion was the annual town meeting, held each spring to account for supplies, land rights, and agreements among the families. In ordinary years it was a sober but necessary assembly, overseen by Reverend Harrow and the town elders. In 1859, however, the meeting carried an atmosphere of dread. Every household had felt the reach of the silence, whether through a neighbor's sudden death, a child's unnatural stillness, or the eerie sense that something unseen monitored every breath. The air itself seemed charged with anticipation as the families filed into the meeting house, their boots muffled on the wooden planks, their faces pale and expressionless in the glow of lanterns. The meeting began in ordinary fashion, with reports on grain stores, fishing yields, and accounts of debts. Yet the proceedings were punctuated by a tension no one named. Not a cough, not a shuffle, not a murmur broke the cadence of Reverend Harrow's voice as he recited the year's burdens. Then, without warning, a strange noise erupted from the back of the hall. It was not quite a laugh, but a strangled gasp that carried the unmistakable rhythm of amusement. Heads turned sharply toward the sound, and the room froze. A young farmhand, scarcely 20 years old, had dropped a ledger he was holding, and in the shock of its fall, a small burst of nervous laughter had escaped him. The silence that followed was absolute, every eye fixed on the boy, who stood trembling, his face drained of blood. For a moment, nothing happened, and then, as if the silence itself had chosen its moment, the boy collapsed. Witnesses later described his death as instantaneous, his body seizing in a grotesque rictus that twisted his mouth into the very shape of the sound he had made. He was carried out into the night, but the assembly remained, paralyzed by terror. The lesson was clear. Even in the heart of the town's most solemn gathering, the prohibition remained absolute, and the penalty was immediate. But the night did not end with a single death. As the congregation sat in stunned silence, a sound began to swell from the rafters. At first faint, like the creaking of timbers in a storm, it grew into something unmistakable, a low murmur that rose and fell with the cadence of suppressed laughter. No one moved, but the sound spread, weaving through the beams above them, circling the hall as though the very building had taken on the forbidden act. Some claimed they felt the vibration in their bones. Others swore that shadows shifted on the walls in time with the noise. The murmur grew until it was almost deafening, a chorus of laughter without joy, without faces, a disembodied mockery that filled the meeting house like smoke. Panic broke the discipline that had bound the villagers for so long. Families surged toward the doors, trampling benches and knocking lanterns to the floor. Flames licked the edges of the room as spilled oil ignited, casting grotesque shadows across the walls. Mothers clutched children, men dragged the elderly to safety, and all the while the sound persisted, unearthly, relentless, echoing through the timbers even as fire consumed them. The meeting house collapsed before dawn, leaving only smoldering ruins and the memory of the laughter that had poured from its walls. In the aftermath, the survivors gathered at the churchyard, too shaken to speak. Some claimed that the sound had not been laughter at all, but a kind of summoning, the voice of whatever force had claimed dominion over the town. Others insisted it had been the voices of the dead, echoing back the amusement that had been denied them in life. Regardless of interpretation, none could deny that the meeting house itself had been destroyed not by fire alone, but by the weight of what had transpired within its walls. The burial of the young farmhand became emblematic of the town's fate. His grave was marked not with scripture, but with a plain stone, uninscribed, as though even memory of his offense might invite danger. The ruins of the meeting house were left untouched, a blackened scar at the edge of the village. Families avoided the site, whispering that laughter still echoed there on windless nights, carried on air thick with smoke and sorrow. The night of the gathering was remembered not only as a catastrophe, but as the moment when the silence of Damariscotta revealed itself to be more than discipline, more than curse. It was a presence, an entity that could mock, punish, and destroy. The deaths that had begun with isolated incidents had culminated in collective revelation. The town now understood that their restraint was not merely habit but covenant, enforced by something that demanded their submission. The climax was not in the fire or the death of a boy, but in the unmasking of a truth that left no room for denial. The silence had become alive. By the end of that year, Damariscotta stood hollowed, its people broken into shells of obedience. The laughter that had once been natural to human life had become a weapon turned against them, wielded by a force that thrived on its absence. The town's story, inscribed in diaries and whispered to travelers, spread across Maine as a warning. Yet no explanation, no doctrine, no physician's note could erase the memory of that night when silence itself laughed. And the people of Damariscotta understood they were no longer its keepers, but its captives. The fire that swallowed the meeting house did not consume the force that had revealed itself there. If anything, the ruin seemed to grant it broader dominion. In the days that followed, the town moved as if under orders no one had spoken. The elders posted sentries at the blackened lot, and families barred shutters even at noon. The smell of wet ash clung to clothing and hair, and the wind that came off the harbor carried an odd resonance, as though it had learned the shape of that disembodied laughter and could not forget it. The night of the gathering had unmasked a presence that mocked restraint by wearing it as a mask. Now, with the town's most public space gone, the silence withdrew into houses like a retreating tide that refused to ebb. Reverend Harrow convened what remained of the congregation in the churchyard, choosing the open air as though walls themselves had become suspect. He ordered a month of absolute gravity, no songs, no stories, no gatherings beyond prayer and labor. Families were told to keep lamps low, to speak only when necessary, and to avoid the slightest play of expression. The church bell, once struck daily, was left silent, its rope coiled like a snake at the base of the steeple. Yet even this expanded discipline felt belated. The people obeyed out of habit, but belief had curdled into dread. They no longer saw silence as virtue but as tribute, a levy paid to something that had pronounced itself sovereign. Then came the fractures that proved submission could not purchase safety. A seamstress collapsed at her table, needle still poised above a hem, her mouth fixed in a narrow half-curve. A widower tending nets at the pier sank to his knees and did not rise, his eyes glassy with the glaze of a grin no one witnessed forming. At a burial for the farmhand who died in the meeting house, a distant cousin bit his lip so hard at the sight of children dropping clods on the coffin that blood stained his teeth. He was found cold at home before dawn. The deaths no longer required provocation. It was enough to stand where laughter had once been possible, enough to carry the memory of mirth in the body like a contraband spark. Harrow turned to the only remedy he could name, purification by rite. He declared a vigil of stillness to last 7 days and nights, an unbroken fast from speech and music. Families marked their doors with charcoal crosses, covered mirrors, and pinned scraps of black cloth over mantel clocks so that the tick would not tempt rhythm into the room. Children were bedded early and wakened in shifts to recite verses in monotone so sleep would not loosen the jaw into an unguarded smile. The elders walked the lanes at midnight, pausing to press their palms to window panes. If they felt the tremor of unseen movement within, they moved on, unwilling to know which household fought its private war against a rising impulse. On the third night of the vigil, a sound passed through town that was neither laugh nor wind. It traveled like a pressure wave, lifting fine ash from the meeting-house lot into a swirl that glowed in moonlight. The ash settled across dwellings in a pattern seen again and again that winter, the faint arc of a mouth, the suggestion of teeth. In the morning, children traced the shapes with fingers and were slapped away, not for disobedience, but because the sight pressed against the limits of endurance. A few families scrubbed their thresholds so raw that wood fibers lifted like fur. The arc returned with the next fog. Documents from that week, loose pages later found in a chest beneath the parsonage stairs, show how far the town's understanding shifted in a handful of days. Harrow's notes, once thunderous with admonition, turned confessional. He wrote that restraint had ceased to function as protection and had become the very instrument by which the presence shaped them. He described a dream in which the town knelt with mouths sewn shut, and the thread that sealed them hummed as if plucked. On the fifth night of the vigil, he attempted an intervention of the old world. He climbed the steeple and struck the bell. The first blow produced a flat, wrong note, with a wavering overtone that set teeth on edge. On the second blow, the bell cracked along a casting flaw and exhaled a sound unmistakable to anyone who had survived the meeting-house, the hollow, mirthless contour of a laugh. The rope burned Harrow's palms as it kicked free, and the bell never rang again. The failure of the bell was a watershed. The instrument meant to call the faithful had learned the enemy's voice. The elders admitted at last what none dared name. They governed nothing. Some families fled inland that very night, traveling by cart with lamps deadened under blankets. Others tore down the tokens and notices that had converted neighbors into wardens, as if by dismantling the scaffolding of discipline they could deprive the presence of its favorite tool. But flight brought no relief. A woman who reached her sister's home upriver smiled by accident at a child's mispronounced grace and was found hours later with the familiar mask. A carpenter who took work in a mill town failed to laugh at a foreman's jest and died on the walk home, as if the body punished even the intention. Meanwhile, the ruins of the meeting-house refused to cool, not with heat, but with attention. Travelers who skirted the lot said that the air around it wavered on windless days. A boy sent to fetch kindling swore his own reflection in a puddle grinned when his face did not. The physician whose journals had carried the last scraps of rational explanation recorded a final set of observations before closing his practice. He noted that the phenomenon now preceded sensation. Patients displayed the postures of laughter with no stimulus, as if nerves rehearsed an act the mind had not chosen. He wrote a single sentence beneath his last case, "The body remembers what the town forbids," and folded the book shut. With the seventh night of the vigil, Harrow announced one last measure. The church would be opened at dawn. Those who wished could enter singly, kneel, and leave a token of forfeiture. Rings, ribbons, children's toys carved with smiling faces, anything that bound them to the life before the prohibition. He believed, or needed to believe, that an offering might restore boundary. The line formed at sunrise and moved without speech. Piles grew at the altar like archaeologies of abandoned joy. A mother placed a tinderbox painted with a jigging sailor. A father set down a whistle. A child laid a wooden puppet whose mouth opened on a hinge. When the last family withdrew, Harrow lit the offerings. The smoke rose straight and black to the rafters, and before finding the vent, curled into a single shape traced 100 times that winter the arc, the teeth. The congregation broke and fled, and the fire consumed only ash. Nothing else in the church charred. That was the breaking point. The town had offered memory, and memory answered in mockery. Within a fortnight, half the households had left, scattering into coves and hamlets where their sobriety passed for eccentricity, until the first small accident invited the old pattern to announce itself. Those who remained dismantled what could be dismantled: benches, lecterns, the ruined frame of the meeting house. The cracked bell was lowered and buried at the edge of the cemetery under stones that bore no names. The black lot was fenced and no one entered. The prohibition no longer required proclamation. It simply was. The climax of Damariscotta's ordeal, then, was not merely the night the meeting house burned or the bell spoke back in a broken laugh. It was the recognition that the town had forged the instrument of its captivity out of endurance and piety, and that the presence had taken that instrument into its keeping. Silence no longer asked, it enforced. Restraint no longer protected, it punished. The people could neither break the rule nor keep it without cost. In that paradox lay the final defeat and the line that would carry forward into legend, a place where laughter killed and obedience did not save, where the sea learned to hold its breath and where the living moved through their days like mourners, certain at last that something listened and preferred them that way. When the last embers of Damariscotta's defiance faded into the silence it had forged, the town ceased to exist in the ordinary sense. It did not vanish from maps, nor did its houses collapse, but it transformed into a place defined less by presence than by absence. Families that remained moved through routines stripped of every gesture that once carried joy. Work was done with rigid efficiency. Births and deaths occurred with scarcely a word spoken. The prohibition against laughter, once preached by Reverend Harrow as moral discipline, had become the unspoken law of survival. It was not taught to children as a virtue, but absorbed as an instinct, a reflex that guided every breath. The exodus had left gaps like pulled teeth along the lanes, empty farmsteads, boarded windows, orchards untended. The census of 1860 recorded a dramatic decline, but numbers cannot convey the quality of life that persisted. Those who left carried the story with them, whispering it in taverns and kitchens until it spread beyond Maine. Yet the shape of the tale shifted in each telling. For some, Damariscotta became a cautionary parable about religious excess. For others, a whispered legend of a cursed town. Travelers avoided it not from knowledge but from intuition, sensing that the silence at its borders was not the stillness of peace, but of dread. Authorities who investigated found little to prosecute. There were no mass graves, no clear evidence of crime. Death certificates bore vague causes: heart failure, apoplexy, wasting illness. Medical men spoke of hysteria, communal delusion, perhaps an epidemic misinterpreted through superstition. Reports filed in Augusta and Boston dismissed the accounts as folklore, with only occasional marginalia admitting that the number of sudden deaths seemed statistically anomalous. The wider world, eager to move past its own traumas of economic depression and political unrest, had no appetite for the absurd suggestion that a town had been undone by the sound of laughter. Yet the consequences persisted in the land itself. Mariners along the coast claimed that when their ships anchored near the harbor, sound carried strangely, whistles muffled, voices lost clarity, and even the waves seemed to break with subdued cadence. Fishermen spoke of nets hauled without banter, as if the sea itself demanded reverence. Some insisted that gulls refused to cry overhead when circling the inlet, their calls caught in their throats until they flew beyond the town's invisible perimeter. These tales might have been dismissed as seamen's exaggerations, except that visitors remarked on the same uncanny quiet. The silence had become not merely custom but contagion, shaping the physical environment. The children who grew within the prohibition became its most disturbing legacy. Raised without the sound of their own laughter, they developed mannerisms marked by restraint and solemnity, far beyond their years. Their games carried no mirth, only ritualized movements, mimicry without levity. When outsiders observed them, they noted an eerie poise, voices pitched low, eyes wary of sudden noise. To other communities, these children seemed unnatural, and they grew into adults who carried the stigma wherever they went. Migrants from Damariscotta were often regarded as aloof or cold, incapable of conviviality. Some married into other towns and softened over generations, but others perpetuated the inheritance of silence as if it were bloodline rather than habit. Folklorists in the early 20th century uncovered fragments of journals preserved in attics. The most cited was Harrow's final book, water-damaged and incomplete, yet containing enough to chill even the skeptical. His entries reveal the slow collapse of his faith into something darker. He wrote of the silence as if it had become a living covenant, binding the town not to God, but to an unnamed power that demanded restraint as its sacrament. He described dreams of strings stretched across mouths like the chords of instruments, vibrating whenever mirth was attempted. He confessed that he no longer prayed for deliverance, only for continuity that the silence would hold, so the laughter could never return. He died in 1863, his death recorded blandly as apoplexy, though his parishioners later whispered that he had smiled in his final breath, and that the expression killed him. The physical remnants of the town decayed slowly, but with peculiar uniformity. The meeting-house ruins never sprouted new growth. Grass yellowed at the perimeter as if soil remembered fire too vividly to host life again. The cracked bell, buried at the cemetery's edge, remained undisturbed despite efforts by collectors in later decades. Local men who attempted to unearth it reported crushing headaches, nausea, or sudden nosebleeds until they abandoned the work. The stone cairn above it was left intact, an improvised monument that locals avoided but would not dismantle. The silence, it seemed, defended itself. In oral traditions across Maine, Damariscotta entered the register of ghost towns, but with a difference. Rather than being haunted by apparitions, it was said to be haunted by the absence of sound. Hikers who wandered too close claimed their own laughter, faltered into coughs, or that jokes lost coherence on their tongues. A few reported hearing the faint echo of mirth carried on the wind, though no one could identify its source. Such accounts became campfire stories, then regional legends, until the truth was obscured beneath layers of folklore. Yet the bones of the narrative remained recognizable, a town that forbade laughter and in doing so bound itself to something merciless. In broader cultural memory, Damariscotta's fate became symbolic. Ministers in nearby parishes used it as warning against extremity, a parable about joyless piety. Physicians wrote of it as a case study in mass hysteria. Writers seized on the imagery for Gothic tales. But for descendants of those who lived there, the memory was more intimate. Some preserved genealogies with gaps, refusing to speak the names of relatives who had died under the prohibition. Others carried heirlooms marked not by pride, but by unease photographs of unsmiling families, hymnals without marginalia, toys worn smooth from use yet untouched by joy. The silence was not confined to place, but traveled through bloodlines, an inheritance of restraint. The ultimate consequence lay not in numbers or documents, but in what the story revealed about human vulnerability. A town stripped of laughter did not collapse in riot or rebellion. It endured, obeyed, complied, until endurance became destruction. That revelation unsettled outsiders more than the suggestion of curses or spirits. For if silence could rule a town so completely, could it not rule elsewhere? Was the prohibition born from the supernatural, or from the human capacity to internalize fear until it governed thought and breath? Historians, psychologists, and folklorists debated, but none could dispel the weight of the account. By the late 19th century, Damariscotta had diminished to a scattering of households. Maps retained the name but marked it with parentheses as though acknowledging its liminal status. Visitors reported the same pervasive quiet even in its decline. Then gradually it disappeared altogether, absorbed into surrounding municipalities. Yet the legend survived, carried by those who refused to forget. The silence became metaphor, invoked whenever communities repressed joy in the name of order, whenever laughter was seen as threat. Thus, the resolution of Damariscotta's story was not neat restoration but enduring shadow. It did not recover its laughter, nor did the silence dissolve. Instead, it left a caution imprinted on collective memory, that what begins as discipline can harden into dominion, and what begins as reverence can become obedience to something unnameable. The consequence was not simply the death of individuals, but the transformation of an entire town into a monument of absence, a place where joy had been forbidden and where silence, once invited, refused to leave. The story of Damariscotta, the town without laughter, lingers not as a tale of ghosts, but as a reminder of what happens when fear governs life more completely than hope. A community silenced itself into obedience, stripping away the very sound that makes us human, until silence became a living covenant that consumed them. The ruins are gone, absorbed into new towns and new maps, but the legend remains, whispered as a warning. Joy, when denied, becomes dangerous, and silence, when enforced, can be deadlier than any storm. What do you believe truly happened in that coastal village of Maine? Was it a curse, a sickness, or the terrible power of human discipline carried too far? Share your thoughts in the comments and let us know where you are watching from. Subscribe to Anathema of Fear, ring the notification bell, and join us for more tales from America's forgotten past, stories buried in ledgers, whispered in diaries, and hidden in shadows that polite history tried to erase. Until the next chapter, remember this: even the absence of laughter can echo louder than screams.